The story begins in the setting of a seemingly conventional family, where, due to the long working hours and constant professional dedication of the parents, the grandparents took on an almost parental role in raising their two grandchildren. Sophia and Lucas, the two siblings, had spent most of their childhood and adolescence at their grandparents' house. The family dynamic had always been like this: Sophia and Lucas' parents, absorbed in their jobs and with few opportunities to spend time with their children, trusted the grandparents to care for and educate their little ones. The grandparents' house, an old building with a front and back garden, had a special atmosphere. It was a place where time seemed to stand still. The walls were filled with black and white family photos, memories from previous generations, while the furniture, somewhat worn but impeccably cared for, reflected years of family history. In every corner there were objects that told a story: an antique trunk with wooden toys, a pendulum clock that chimed every hour, and a collection of dusty books that Grandpa, a man of few words but a restless mind, had accumulated throughout his life. For Sophia and Lucas, each visit to their grandparent house was a new adventure, and the bonds that were formed during those years were deep and unbreakable. From a young age, the siblings became accustomed to an atmosphere full of love and security in their grandparents' house. Grandma, a warm and maternal woman, was in charge of the kitchen and all the small attentions that transformed the daily routine into special moments. Her soft voice and kind gestures always calmed any anxiety, and her dedication to her grandchildren was absolute. Every day, Grandma prepared their favorite meals and pampered them in 1,000 ways, while Grandpa entertained them with stories from his youth and taught them about life. For them, grandparents were not just authority figures. They were guides, companions, and protectors. As Sophia and Lucas grew up, visits to their grandparent house became a constant in their lives, something that was part of their regular routine. Weekends, school vacations, and holidays meant full days at their grandparents' house. There, the two siblings found respite from the fast-paced lives of their parents, who, although they loved them deeply, were not able to spend as much time with them as they would have liked. Their parents worked tirelessly, striving to give them a stable life full of opportunities, although at the cost of sacrificing much of their presence in the children's lives. For the grandparents, this responsibility of raising their grandchildren was both an honor and an opportunity to relive the moments they once had with their own children. They felt fortunate to be able to accompany Sophia and Lucas at every stage of their growth, seeing how they developed, how they learned, and how they forged their personalities. The grandfather was especially proud to see his granddaughter grow up, whom he saw as a younger and more promising version of his own daughter. Although the grandfather was a traditional man, with a strong and reserved character, he had a special bond with Sophia, who saw him as a hero since she was little. He was always willing to protect her and teach her new things, becoming a fundamental figure in her life. Over time, the siblings went from being playful and dependent children to teenagers with their own interests and opinions. Lucas, the youngest, began to develop an independent and somewhat distant personality, while Sophia, always more outgoing and affectionate, maintained a particular closeness with her grandparents, especially with her grandfather, with whom she shared many talks and walks. Despite the changes typical of adolescence, she never stopped seeing her grandparents as the fundamental pillar of her life. In them she found a refuge, a space where she could be herself without the pressures or expectations of her environment. The grandfather, who had always had a protective and affectionate relationship with his granddaughter, began to notice changes in Sophia when she reached adolescence. The physical changes and the maturity she was beginning to develop did not go unnoticed by him. Although he tried to justify these thoughts as simple grandfatherly pride, something darker began to emerge in his mind, although in such a subtle way that he himself could not fully understand it. He felt an inner turmoil that led him to be more attentive to Sophia, to look for moments to be alone with her, and, without realizing it, he began to feel an increasingly disturbing attraction. When Sophia turned 19, these thoughts intensified. The relationship that the grandfather had always considered innocent and tender began to be tinged with desires and feelings that he should never have harbored. Sophia, oblivious to all this, continued to see her grandfather with the same respect and affection as always. However, he had begun to become obsessed, to look at her in a way that she could not perceive. With each visit to the grandparents' house, he found some excuse to observe her, especially when she was alone or in moments of carelessness. When Sophia stayed in the guest room or spent time in the bathroom, the grandfather looked for ways to observe her without her noticing. The family, however, continued not to notice anything out of the ordinary. For them, the grandfather was still the same loving and protective man as always, and the closeness with his grandchildren was natural and understandable. No one could imagine that behind that facade of respect and love, An obsession was developing that would slowly consume the grandfather's mind and lead him to cross unthinkable limits. Sophia, for her part, enjoyed the company of her grandparents, especially in those moments when she felt overwhelmed by the demands of her university and social life. Every time she returned to her grandparent house, she experienced a feeling of peace and nostalgia, remembering the years of her childhood and adolescence when that place was her refuge. In a certain sense, Sophia saw her grandparents' house as a safe space, a place where she could rest and disconnect from her worries. However, with each visit, the grandfather felt more and more disturbed by that mix of family love and forbidden desires that tormented him in silence. The grandmother, although always attentive and dedicated, also did not perceive the change that was brewing in her husband. For her, the presence of the grandchildren continued to be a reason for happiness, and she did not notice the tension that began to grow in the environment every time Sophia was near. Perhaps it was familiarity, or perhaps the passage of time had made her stop paying attention to such details. In any case, the grandmother continued to believe that her husband was the same honest and loyal man she had always known, unable to imagine that he was on the verge of losing control. Over time, this obsession in the grandfather's mind was transformed into an insatiable need to have Sophia close. He tried harder and harder to create opportunities to be alone with her, although Sophia, in her innocence, saw it as a gesture of affection and protection. The grandfather found excuses to enter the room when she was changing, or to be in the bathroom when she finished showering. At first, these situations seemed like coincidences, but little by little they began to repeat themselves with a frequency that should have raised suspicions, although Sophia still did not perceive anything out of the ordinary. This obsession, fueled by each encounter and each opportunity to see her in private situations, became the driving force that drove the grandfather to act in ways he would never have imagined. However, for him, this was only the beginning of a series of decisions that would lead to devastating consequences for the entire family. As time went by, the relationship between Sophia and her grandfather began to change in an unexpected way, although imperceptible to others. After having grown up under her grandparents' roof and having spent the most important years of her childhood and adolescence in that house, Sophia had become a young adult of 19 years old, full of life and with a vibrant spirit. Her beauty and charisma did not go unnoticed by anyone, but what no one knew was that someone very close to her, someone she trusted blindly, was watching her with different eyes. Someone who had been a paternal and protective figure in her life since she was little, was now beginning to harbor disturbing thoughts about her. Sophia's grandfather had always been a man of reserved character, somewhat distant in his dealings with other adults, but extraordinarily affectionate and close with his grandchildren. The relationship he had with Sophia had been, until then, completely innocent and full of genuine affection. He had seen her grow up, he had accompanied her in her first steps, in her first words and in the little adventures she lived in her grandparents' house. However, when she reached 19 years old, Sophia began to awaken in her grandfather a series of emotions that he did not know how to manage. It all began in a subtle way. At first, the grandfather tried to rationalize these thoughts, considering them as a mere grandfatherly pride who observed with satisfaction the growth and maturity of his granddaughter. But he soon realized that those thoughts went much further. Every time she was at home, the grandfather could not help but observe her in a more intense, deeper way. His eyes followed her in every movement, in every gesture, and little by little, that natural admiration transformed into an obsession that disturbed him and consumed him in silence. It was in those moments of privacy, when Sophia was in the guest room or in the bathroom, that the grandfather felt an attraction that he could not control. Although he tried to justify himself by telling himself that he was just looking out for her, he was actually looking for excuses to watch her when she was off guard. He began to take every opportunity to see his granddaughter in private situations, waiting for the moment when she would let her guard down. The obsession grew and became a need that pushed him to act in ways he himself would never have imagined. Every time Sophia locked herself in the bathroom to shower, Grandpa would find an excuse to approach the door or walk near the hallway. Sometimes, he would even stay in the hallway for several minutes, making sure no one else was around. He would listen to the sound of running water, imagining what was happening on the other side of the door. His thoughts became increasingly dark and forbidden, but his obsession was so strong that he could no longer stop himself. Sophia, completely oblivious to her grandfather's thoughts, continued to visit her grandparents' house with the same confidence as ever. For her, that place was still her refuge, a place where she could disconnect from the pressures and responsibilities of life. She did not suspect anything out of the ordinary and continued to see her grandfather as the loving and protective man he had been all her life. However, Grandpa was no longer the same. Over time, his desires intensified, and soon he began to look for ways to be alone with Sophia. He took advantage of every opportunity to get close to her, to be in her personal space. When she changed clothes in her room, he would find an excuse to pass by the half-open door. Although at first these situations seemed casual, little by little they began to repeat themselves more frequently. Sophia, in her innocence, did not perceive anything strange. For her, these moments were just coincidences. Grandpa's mind was caught in a spiral of obsessive thoughts. Every time he saw her, every time he heard her voice or perceived her presence, these forbidden desires intensified. His obsession with Sophia reached such a point that he began to devise ways to spend more time alone with her. He organized walks and activities in which only the two of them participated, under the pretext of spending some quality time. Although these moments seemed innocent to Sophia, for Grandpa they were opportunities to feed his obsession. One of those days, taking advantage of an afternoon when Grandma had left home and her brother was at another activity, Grandpa and Sophia were left alone. Sophia was in her room, organizing some of her things and preparing to return home after a weekend with her grandparents. Grandpa, feeling that this was a unique opportunity, approached the door and, with some excuse, entered the room. The conversation began casually, as always, but there was something different in the atmosphere. Grandpa looked at her more intensely. His eyes denoted a mix of nervousness and desire that Sophia did not know how to interpret. As the conversation progressed, Grandpa began to compliment her, words that, although they seemed harmless, carried an emotional charge that Sophia was beginning to notice. "You are so pretty, Sophia," he told her, with a look that began to make her uncomfortable. Although she tried to smile and respond kindly, something in her grandfather's gaze made her feel strange. It was a feeling she had never experienced before and couldn't understand. Over time, these interactions became more frequent. Every time Sophia visited the house, Grandpa would find a way to get close to her, to touch her with seemingly innocent excuses, or to seek moments alone. Sophia, however, tried to ignore her own discomfort, thinking that maybe she was just imagining things. She told herself that her grandfather was the same as always, that there was no reason to feel fear or discomfort. But Grandpa couldn't stop. His obsession had reached a point where it was no longer enough for him to just secretly observe her. He wanted more. He wanted to have her for himself. Despite the dark thoughts that tormented him, he began to rationalize his actions, convincing himself that these feelings were inevitable and that, somehow, he had the right to feel what he felt. One day, when they were alone in the house, the grandfather decided to cross a line that he should never have crossed. Taking advantage of the fact that the grandmother was out shopping and that Lucas, Sophia's brother, was at university, the grandfather approached Sophia and began to show her much more obvious attention. He told her how important she was to him, how she had changed his life, and he began to caress her face in a way that left no room for doubt. At first, Sophia was paralyzed. She could not believe what was happening. That father figure, in whom she had trusted all her life, was acting in a way she would never have imagined. She tried to stop him, to get away, but the grandfather convinced her that he was not doing anything wrong, that he was only expressing his affection. The emotional manipulation was such that Sophia, confused and disturbed, did not know how to react. Over time, her grandfather's pressure and manipulation made Sophia end up giving in to his wishes, even without fully understanding what was happening. The relationship between them became a dark and disturbing secret, an emotional burden that Sophia carried in silence, not daring to tell anyone. The days at her grandparents' house began to take on a somber tone for Sophia. What had once been her refuge, her safe place, had transformed into a space full of uncomfortable silences and furtive glances. The young woman carried an unbearable weight, a mixture of guilt and confusion, not knowing how to free herself from that situation. The grandfather, for his part, maintained an appearance of normality in front of others, acting with the same cordiality and kindness as always. However, inside, the feeling of power and dominance over Sophia filled him with a dark and twisted pleasure. It was not long before the other members of the family began to notice small changes in Sophia. Lucas, her brother, was the first to notice that something strange was happening. During his visits to the grandparents' house, he noticed that Sophia was quieter, more withdrawn. The joy and spontaneity that used to characterize her seemed to have vanished. In addition, her answers were evasive and her countenance often seemed to reflect a deep sadness. Lucas, although not fully understanding what was happening, worried about his sister and began to suspect that something was not right. One day, after a family meal at the grandparents' house, Lucas confronted Sophia. He asked her if everything was okay, if there was something that worried or bothered her. Sophia, afraid that the truth would come out, tried to avoid the questions, saying that she was just tired from the pace of university. But Lucas was not satisfied with her answers. Intuition told him that there was something much deeper that she was not telling. She insisted, and with each question, the tension increased. Finally, Sophia could not contain herself any longer. In a fit of desperation, she confessed to her brother what had been happening between her and their grandfather. Hearing those words, Lucas was in shock, unable to process what his sister had just told him. He couldn't believe that someone whom they both considered a figure of respect and trust, someone who had been by his side throughout his life, was capable of betraying that trust in such an atrocious way. Lucas's anger was immediate. He felt betrayed, outraged, and deeply hurt. His first impulse was to confront his grandfather, yell at him and make him pay for all the harm he had caused his sister. But Sophia, terrified, begged him not to do anything. She begged him to keep the secret, as she feared the consequences that a direct confrontation could bring. Lucas, although furious, decided to respect his sister's wish, at least for the moment. Despite this, Lucas could not sit back and do nothing. He felt that he had to do something, that his grandfather could not go unpunished after what he had done. It was then that he decided to talk to his grandmother. He knew that his grandmother was a strong and perceptive woman, and he trusted that, once she found out, she would not hesitate to act. That night, after making sure that Sophia was calm and that his grandfather was in another room, Lucas approached his grandmother and asked to speak in private. With a trembling voice, he began to tell her what he had discovered. At first, his grandmother could not understand what Lucas was trying to tell her. The mere idea that her husband had done something so terrible was incomprehensible to her. But as Lucas gave her more details, his expression changed. It went from bewilderment to horror, and from horror to a silent indignation that left her paralyzed. His grandmother listened in silence, her face pale and her gaze lost. Lucas's words echoed in her mind, each one like a dagger stabbing into her heart. She would never have imagined that the man she had shared her life with, the one who had been her companion for so many years, would be capable of something so repulsive. The betrayal she felt was not only towards her granddaughter, but also towards herself. The grandmother, who had always trusted him blindly, felt deeply humiliated and hurt. After a few minutes of silence, the grandmother, with a determined expression on her face, told Lucas that they could not let this go without consequences. Although they both knew that the option of confronting him directly was not viable, they understood that they had to take action. There was too much at stake, and both Sophia and the family deserved justice. It was then that the grandmother proposed a radical solution. They would make it look like a natural death. At first, Lucas was surprised and reluctant to the idea, but the grandmother convinced him. She explained that, in this way, not only could Sophia free herself from her grandfather's yoke, but they would also avoid exposing the family to a scandal that could destroy them all. It would be a silent revenge, a justice done with their own hands. The plan was carefully and precisely devised. The grandmother, who had always been in charge of the kitchen and family meals, knew exactly how to act without raising suspicion. They decided that the next time the family gathered at the grandparents' house, they would put their plan into action. The grandmother, with Lucas' help, would prepare a special meal in which they would add a poison in a dose sufficient to cause death without leaving obvious traces. The day of the meeting arrived, and the family sat around the table, as so many times before. The grandfather, oblivious to what was being plotted against him, smiled and chatted with his grandchildren and his wife, not imagining that this would be the last time he would share a meal with them. The grandmother, keeping her usual calm and demeanor, served the dishes and made sure that the grandfather received a special portion. During the meal, Sophia and Lucas could barely hide the tension they felt. Both were nervous, aware that they were about to put an end to a situation that had destroyed their lives. The grandmother, for her part, kept a calm expression, although inside she was fighting a mixture of pain and fury. She knew that this was an irreversible decision, but she also knew that she could not allow her husband to continue causing harm to her family. The grandfather ate with total nonchalance, without suspecting what was happening. The conversation flowed as always, although the family members seemed quieter and more serious than usual. After finishing his plate, the grandfather began to feel strange. At first, he thought it was just a slight discomfort, but soon his symptoms worsened. He felt like he was short of breath, his heart was beating uncontrollably, and a cold sweat began to run down his forehead. The grandmother, feigning surprise and concern, approached him and asked if he was okay. The grandfather tried to respond, but the words would not come out of his mouth. Little by little, his body began to weaken, and he finally fell to the ground, unable to stand. The family watched the scene in silence, not knowing exactly how to react. Although the plan had been carefully laid out, seeing the grandfather in that state generated a mixture of emotions in everyone. Finally, the grandfather stopped breathing. The grandmother, keeping up her role until the end, called an ambulance and, with a trembling voice, explained that her husband had suddenly collapsed. The paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing to be done. The death was declared natural, with no one suspecting the truth behind that death. Sophia, Lucas and the grandmother kept the secret forever.